Thank you. Good afternoon. I'd like to get started. My name is Cindy Arnson. I'm the director of the Latin American program here at the Wilson Center. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this event to discuss U.S.-Cuba relations. There are many dear friends and colleagues in the audience, and I think their affection and regard for Lars Schultz is testimony, to their being here. You have the bio, so I won't spend much time going over them, but I'd simply like to add that Lars, in addition to being a former fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, is probably one of the most important authors that people read in courses on U.S. Latin American relations, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s. He's written two books that really are classics in the field and have withstood the test of time. One is his book on human rights, United States Policy toward Latin America, which was published by Princeton University Press in 1981, and his book on national security and U.S. policy toward Latin America, also published by Princeton later that decade in 1987. He's the author of any number of additional books and articles, as well as short pieces. And Lars, it's a pleasure to have you here to celebrate the publication of this thin little tome called The United States and the Cuban Revolution, that infernal little Cuban republic, which is, as you've seen, available for sale outside the door. I'm also delighted to welcome a Woodrow Wilson Center board member, Ignacio Sanchez, who has, again, has worked for much of his lifetime on issues having to do with U.S.-Cuban relations, even if that has not been a formal part of a job title that he has had. And finally, Tomas Bilbao, who has had extensive experience in the policy arena, as well as serving as chair of the Cuba Study Group, has worked very actively with the Office of Senator Mil Martinez. So I'd like to ask Lars for some opening statements, and then we'll have the comments by Iggy Sanchez and by Tomas, and finally I will turn the program over to Jose Raul Perales, our senior program associate, who spearheads the Cuba work here at the Woodrow Wilson Center's Latin American program. Thank you, Lars.
Thank you, Cindy. And thank you all for coming. As you will very quickly discover, that was an excessively generous introduction. But I need to begin with a confession. Unlike Ignacio and Tomas and many of you here, I know very little about Cuba. I'm a student of inter-American relations, and any student of inter-American relations of my age is also automatically a student of U.S.-Cuban relations. What I try to explain in this book is the dysfunctional relationship between our two countries. And I begin by asking the question that's obvious, what for the almost now a half century have we been trying to accomplish? At one level, the explanation is very simple. We've been trying to protect our interests. Specifically, our policy toward the revolution has reflected first the economic concerns of U.S. investors. Then, second, and much more important, the security concerns of U.S. defense managers. And then, more recently, the electoral concerns of U.S. politicians who are seeking the support of Cuban Americans. But this is how you would explain U.S. policy, or the forces driving U.S. policy toward any country, as an ever-varying mixture of economic, security, and domestic political interests. What drove me to write this? And what makes the U.S.-Cuban relationship so intriguing is the ideology, the mental software that underlies our efforts to protect these three interests. And what I'd like to do today, and Cynthia told me that I have 20 minutes? 20, 25, okay. What I'd like to use my 25 minutes doing is focusing on the three most important beliefs in this ideological package that we have, our Cuba ideology. The first is a belief that with occasional short, brief bursts of attention, we can safely ignore all those little countries that lie down there beneath the United States. We are big and rich and powerful. Cuba is obviously dwarfed by its continent-wide northern neighbor. The neighbor that has used a substantial amount of its fabulous wealth to develop the most powerful military in the history of the human race. And that military strength, that raw strength, has given politicians such as Richard Nixon the ability to say, as he did during the 1960 campaign, the United States has the power, and Mr. Castro knows this, to throw him out of office. And that has also given cabinet members such as Secretary of State Alexander Haig the ability to ask President Reagan for a simple green light. What he said, according to Nancy Reagan, is, "You just give me the word and I'll turn that fucking island into a parking lot." Now, if you were a visitor from Mars, what would seem strange to you is why, when the Cubans refused to behave as we insisted, their leaders were not thrown out of office and their country wasn't turned into a parking lot. Now, how they managed to get away with it? Well, for the first 3 decades of the Cuban Revolution, we had a really obvious answer that, among others, Cole Blazer, sitting here in the seersucker sport coat, wrote about before anyone in this room. Cuba balanced U.S. power by enlisting the support of the Soviet Union. But that answer only takes us to about 1990, when the Soviets withdrew their support. A complete explanation for our forbearance has to add this first belief that we just simply don't have much time or energy to spend on these people. A perfect example came in an interview with John Furch, which some of you will remember, a career Foreign Service officer who served as one of the Reagan-era chiefs of mission of the intersection in Havana. In an interview, he recounted a discussion with Fidel Castro that occurred in the mid-1980s. It began with a speech by Castro, a nationally broadcast speech in Cuba, in which the Cuban leader announced that negotiations were underway to accept the return of about 2,700 Mariel excludables. Castro apparently saw this as a gesture of reconciliation, because at a diplomatic reception right after the speech, he called Furch aside. "I want you to carry a message to the American people," Furch recalled Castro as saying. "I want you to tell them that I'm serious about this." And then Furch kept talking in the interview. He said, "Castro continued along this line for the next 15 or 25 minutes, so I sat back and let questions fill my mind. Who does this guy think he is? Does he really think I can tell 220+ million people anything? Okay, I'll tell my brother-in-law in Ohio. But first, I'll have to remind him who Fidel Castro is." But unless there's a crisis, why bother? A list, you watched Mr. Obama. I listened to him today in the Rose Garden speech about health care initiative, the work, the blizzard of activities that are confronting almost any high-level official in the government. And that's all you need to do to explain why Richard Nixon largely ignored Cuba when he finally claimed the presidency, why President Reagan declined to endorse Alexander Haig's parking lot solution, and why Presidential Advisor Arthur Schlesinger Jr. had this to say about the one president who appeared to spend more time than any other on Cuba. Castro was not a major issue for Kennedy, who had much else on his mind. And Latin America is unimportant, not just Cuba, but Latin America in general is also sufficient to explain why, when the United States decided that we had to oust Cuba's revolutionary leaders, we tried a low-cost, covert operation. Many Eisenhower and Kennedy administration officials were convinced that it would be a cakewalk. Perhaps not Wayne Smith, but just about everybody else, including the CIA. In late January, a week and a half after Kennedy's inauguration, the CIA gave the White House an estimate that less than 30% of the population is still with Fidel, and in this 30% are included the Negroes who will not fight. It took JFK's best and brightest exactly 3 months until the Bay of Pigs to learn that the Cubans would, in fact, fight back. Now, certainly we could subdue them, but not with a couple of thousand Cuban exiles. We would have to do it ourselves with the Marines, and we might have to turn the country into a parking lot. So what was Plan B? During a few years of what we today would call state-sponsored terrorism, of torching sugar fields, sabotaging power plants, arming assassins, during a few years of that, we slowly developed a consensus that Cuba wasn't really that important. It just really didn't require costly, decisive action. What happened, I think, is that Lyndon Johnson, who, as you know, was inexperienced in foreign affairs, waited only a few days after inheriting the White House to pick up the phone and ask advice from his friend, the very widely respected and experienced chair of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, J. William Fulbright. In their telephone conversation, Fulbright started to warn LBJ about doing anything dramatic, and the president wouldn't let him get a sentence out of his mouth before he interrupted to agree. "I'm not getting into any Bay of Pigs deal," he said. "I'm just asking you what we ought to do to pinch their nuts more than we're doing." Nut pinching has been U.S. policy ever since. Ever since. We call it an embargo. It's what we do to insignificant aggravations like Cuba. Well, for 3 decades, the fight to contain communism is what justified this policy. But then the Cold War ended, and even low-level hostility became difficult to defend. First of all, of course, it looks bad for a country that claims global leadership to be seen as strangling the economy of a small neighbor, now for no good reason. And then also hostility is even more difficult to maintain when it's opposed by powerful economic interests, like the U.S. farmer. So we needed a good response for our hostility, and that brings me to the second belief in our ideology, that we in the United States are responsible for uplifting Cuba. I think we developed this responsibility, this idea that we're responsible for uplifting Cuba at the beginning, right after the ouster of the Spanish in 1898, when we occupied the island from 1898 to 1902, at the end of which we granted Cubans their independence, but with a major caveat called the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment, as you know, gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuba in order to protect, quote, life, property, and individual liberty. And so President Theodore Roosevelt said this in 1906 when he took over Cuba again. He'd just given them their independence in 1902. In the 1904 campaign, the Republican platform patted themselves on the back for granting Cuba its independence. And in 1906, we took over the island again. He went up to Harvard to give a speech. He was asked, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I am seeking the very minimum of interference necessary to make them good." Now, Roosevelt's new governor of Cuba, who also happened to be the Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, said the same thing. Writing to the readers of National Geographic, he said that our goal is to teach them a higher and better civilization. And he unselfconsciously said exactly the same thing a few months before that directly to Cubans in Havana. At a ceremony reopening the University of Havana, he said, "We are here only to help you, with our arm under your arm, lifting you again on the path of wonderful progress." Now, look, today we no longer announce our responsibility for uplifting. Only occasionally does it pop to the surface, as it's always unscripted now. It popped to the surface beautifully back in 1991 when a reporter shouted out a question. Did any of you listen to President Obama's speech in the Rose Garden today? At the end, a half a dozen reporters started yelling questions at him about the health care reform bills. And he didn't answer them, but this is what happened with President Bush, the first President Bush in 1991. A bunch of people yelled questions. One of which was, you're talking to Gorbachev, you're cozying up to the Soviet Union. How about Cuba and Fidel Castro? And Bush kind of turned on his heel, looked at the questioner, and he said, "What's the point? All I'd tell him is what I'm telling you, to give the people the freedom they want, and then you'll see the United States do exactly what we should, go down and lift those people up." Now, President Bush's immediate predecessor, Ronald Reagan, always said that first, Cuba had to end its alliance with Moscow. But here, in 1991, what happened is very clear to me, at least. When the Cold War ended, the leaders of both of our major political parties reached into the policy cupboard and they pulled out the Platt Amendment, the core of which is a statement of our civilizing responsibility. Like Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft a century ago, today, 2009, we have a new president that insists that the Cuban leaders are misbehaving and that the United States cannot stand by quietly and allow their misbehavior to continue. The Cuban people are not free, President Obama said at the recent Summit of the Americas in Trinidad. And that's our lodestone, our North Star, when it comes to our policy in Cuba. To me, this sounds identical to what President Obama's predecessor said repeatedly during his 8-year tenure. On the campaign trail in 2004, for example, the second President Bush promised, "I will continue to work to ensure that gift of freedom reaches the men and women of Cuba." Now, I only have a few more minutes of your time. Okay. Thank you, Cynthia. Well, let me, though, turn to the third belief in our Cuban ideology, which underlies this bipartisan commitment to uplifting. The existential core of today's policy is our view of the region's inhabitants as a retarded branch of the human species. We struggle, I always struggle, to find a comfortable term instead of retarded. My generation, as many of you know, my generation's choice has been underdeveloped. But we all know what we're talking about. As a U.S. ambassador wrote from Havana in the late 1940s, Cubans possess the superficial charm of clever children, but under the surface they combine the worst characteristics of the Spanish and Negro cultures: laziness, cruelty, irresponsibility, and inbred dishonesty. Now, look, it's probably a sign of human progress that our diplomats no longer write sentences like that. But it's made my job so much more difficult. Because today's political correctness, our self-censorship, means that we have to look at behavior and then infer a belief in Cubans' inferiority. Inferences from behavior are always risky. But for a quick minute, let me mention our most recent plan for Cuba's uplifting. It's this. The report to the President of the Commission for Assistance to a Free Cuba. It was unveiled in 2004 and updated in 2006. Ask yourself this. This is behavior. All right? We wrote a 423-page report called a report of the Commission for Assistance to a Free Cuba. What can we infer from that? Why did we concoct this 400-page report identifying 6 major areas where we should help Cubans, the first and most important of which was in selecting their leaders? Now, the easy, but I think the wrong answer, at least the incomplete answer, is domestic politics, that third interest. President Bush had a re-election campaign coming up. But there was no re-election campaign coming up, and there was no such thing as a Cuban-American voter back in 1901 when Governor General Leonard Wood, writing President Roosevelt from Havana, put his finger exactly on the problem here. No one wants more than I a good and stable government here, but we must see that the right class is in office. General Wood's point in 1901 is the same point being made by President Bush's commission in 2004, and I think, although it may be too early, the same point President Obama made in Trinidad. Left to their own devices, Cubans screw things up. They make bad choices. But to our modern ears, when you hear we must see that the right class is in office, it grates, doesn't it? Tell me yes. It grates down in Chapel Hill. So, because it sounds so presumptuous, we now have a euphemism for it. Hastening Cuba's Transition is the title of Chapter 1 of this report. It specifies 62 steps the United States is currently taking to oust Cuba's undemocratic leaders. Then once Cuba's leaders have been replaced by the right class of people, the class that's democratic, then it's going to be on to the uplifting, the next 5 chapters. The unspoken mental foundation of U.S. policy, of which the report of the Commission for Assistance to a Free Cuba is an absolutely fabulous example. The unspoken mental foundation of U.S. policy is that Cubans cannot solve their own problems. So we Yankees, who are really good at solving problems, should give them a hand. It, as President Obama said, it's our lodestone. It's our North Star. Okay, so what do these 3 beliefs say about the years that lie immediately ahead? Given the disparities between our 2 countries, and look, folks, it's very important to recognize, as I'm sure all of you do, the difference and magnitude of our 2 countries. Our economy is 250 times larger than Cuba's. Given this disparity, I think probably the best wager is that the United States will eventually find some combination of carrots and nut pinching to make the Cubans, to convince them that they should accept a little uplifting. So after we've got the right class in office, you can expect to see an army of contractors from the U.S. Agency for International Development and grantees from the National Endowment for Democracy helping Cuba construct a new and improved country. According to our plan, one immediate focus should be on improving Cuba's Constitution. Our plan for that begins on page 190. In which it points out that, quote, the current communist constitution formalizes an authoritarian one-party political system, unquote. That is, it is not a very good constitution. So then the report lists, quote, some of the provisions that are most inimical to democratic governance. It gives 6 bullet points, the 5th of which is that this inferior constitution that Cuba has, quote, limits inheritance rights, unquote. And then the sentence immediately after the 6 bullet points, the very next sentence says, proceeding during the transition period toward democratic governance would be impossible under such constraints. Now folks, look, ask yourself this. Ask yourself this. What kind of ideology, what kind of mental software is in the head of someone who writes a report that said it is impossible to move toward democracy in Cuba without first amending the Constitution to eliminate limits on inheritance? Inheritance, what you are leaving to your daughter. Well, look, perhaps it'll work this time, and now my time really is up. But 108 years ago, Cuba's Governor General Leonard Wood complained to President Roosevelt that it's next to impossible to make them believe that we have their own interests at heart. Now look, folks, this is a long book, so let me tell you that there is no lesson from this book. There is no lesson from the history of U.S.-Cuban relations since Cuba became a republic in 1902 that is more obviously unlearned in the United States than that Cubans simply do not want to be uplifted by the United States of America. Will we ever learn this lesson? The mere fact that the report of the Commission for Assistance to a Free Cuba is still on the State Department's website suggests that the rising generation of leaders does not even recognize the problem. Until they do, I think the road to Havana is probably going to be pretty bumpy. So here we are. Those of us who are starting to get just the slightest little bit of gray hair have given it our best shot over half a century. If we haven't made much progress as we'd like, well, it's not because we haven't tried. It's because of our ideology. It's first of all been difficult to get anyone's attention because of the belief that other problems and other regions are much more important. Second, once you have their attention, it's been impossible to get Washington to control its compulsion to uplift, which is based upon, third, a belief that Cubans are an underdeveloped people. Now, my generation does not even recognize the existence of this belief about Cubans. And its accompanying compulsion to uplift, a compulsion captured perfectly by this document. So I worry about the future. I worry about it a lot, especially since Cuba is only one case. Just one of those underdeveloped countries that lie down there beneath the United States. And my worries are doubled when I realize that my generation, back when we were younger, made a monumental error. Of all the dumb things that we could have done, we institutionalized the uplifting. We created a permanent uplifting brigade. We made it possible for hundreds, maybe thousands of people in this town to have a government career in uplifting. Until about 1960, our uplifting existed, but it was sporadic. It was in the form of isolated vignettes of, okay, we need a canal, we get this canal zone, it's got lots of Panamanians in it, let's uplift them. But an isolated vignette. But then around 1961 to be precise, we created the Agency for International Development, the goal of which is to develop these little brown people. And then, 2 decades later, we compounded our error by creating the National Endowment for Democracy to help those folks become democratic. Now we have institutions where people are paid a living wage with health insurance, and they're assigned to uplift Latin America. It's just like what happened when the Victorian British created their colonial office. We've institutionalized the white man's burden. Now, it's difficult for me to see how we can ever have a healthy relationship with Latin America as long as we have an Agency for International Development and a National Endowment for Democracy. Disband Aid, stop funding the NED. Come on, I know it's not going to happen. So in the spirit of compromise, let's start with this report. I think we can all agree that this is uplifting on steroids. There's nothing else like it in the history of U.S. policy toward Latin America. Ask Cole Blazer, ask Bill Leogrand. There is nothing like this in the history of our country. We have never done this. We didn't do this for Nazi Germany. This needs to go into the recycling bin. Given the history of U.S.-Cuban relations, which this book is one example, there are plenty of books covering it. Regardless of your view of the Cubans and the Cuban Revolution, given the history of our relations with Cuba, can you imagine anything more counterproductive? And can you imagine that my 25 minutes are up? So I hope Tomas and Ignacio can cast a little bit of sunshine into this room. I thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you. Because we knew that Lars would give such a bland and uncontroversial reading of U.S.-Cuban relations and historical perspective, we invited some people who are more deeply immersed in the policy debates, and if you will, in these various efforts, including those sponsored by AID, which shares the Reagan Building with us, in transforming. I disagree with a lot of recommendations that you just mentioned, but people who have been, more engaged in these efforts for which Lars has painted the historical antecedents. So I welcome the comments of Mr. Sanchez and Mr. Bilbao. Thanks.
Right. Well, I'll be brief because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions from the room. I sort of want to address this from a slightly different perspective. I think a lot of what Lars said, which is tongue-in-cheek, is well documented in his book. It's an authoritative piece, whether you agree with it or not. It's properly footnoted. He's gone into great detail in doing it, and so I congratulate him for putting a piece out there that some people will agree with, some people will shoot at, and say, I disagree with this or the other. But I think that the one item that, from a Cuban-American perspective, and I was born in Cuba. I wasn't born here. But I was born in Cuba on June 12, 1960, and left on August 20th, 1960. And so I like to tell people when I talk about Cuba that my perspective on Cuba and its future is not based on Jose Martí or Antonio Machado or any Antonio Maceo or any of the people that my parents talk about. It's based on, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, people who I learned from. And in that regard, I think that Lars touches on an issue that I always heard perennially growing up, and that was the Yankee occupation of Cuba. And I'm talking about post-1902. If you talk to any Cuban, if you talk to a Cuban lawyer who practiced in Cuba, they will tell you that Cuba did not become an independent republic until 1940, when the 1902 Constitution was rewritten and a constitutional assembly was put in place where everybody participated, from the Batista wing of the Cuban political world to the Communist Party, all participated in this constitutional assembly and passed a constitution that directly repealed and ignored the Platt Amendment. And so when you talk to them, they say the republic was really started in 1940, and it only lived for 12 years. When Batista, towards the end of Carlos Perillo's term, basically took over Cuba in a fashion that was rather simple. Perillo just left. I think Batista really had the police force with him. He didn't even have the full military with him in order to accomplish it. But the point was that at that time, and the reason I'm talking about the story is that there is a very important critique of what Batista did that I think actually forms the basis of U.S. policy. And that critique, which when I've read it, I almost agree with completely. Minor things here or there. But it's Fidel Castro's "History Will Absolve Me" speech, where he specifically attacks Batista for the usurpation of popular sovereignty. And in doing so, he talks about how the Constitution of 1940 must be restored, how Batista has suspended that Constitution, and in so doing has violated the rights of all Cuban citizens to self-determination and to elect their government officials. When you read that speech, there isn't a lawyer, there isn't an analyst, there isn't anyone who reads it who will likely disagree with it. The problem is that when Batista left, the first thing Castro did was ignore his own speech. And it is my belief that U.S. foreign policy since then has been to hold him to his own words. That there must be the ability for the Cuban people to have the right to self-determination. If we had an occupation from 1902 to 1940, and you talk to the old businessmen and they'll all tell you the same thing. By the mid-1900s, the commercial enterprises in Cuba were now being restored back to Cuban hands. They weren't just in American companies' hands and the like. They will tell you the story about how this republic was starting to get on its way, how the Cubans were starting to truly run their own enterprises, their own institutions, their own government. But it was a short-lived time period. It was a 12-year time period. And I think every president since then has basically said that's what they deserve. They deserve the right to self-determination. And that's what Castro has prohibited. Lars mentioned, why haven't Cuban leaders been thrown out? And shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, I remember meeting with a high-ranking KGB officer in Miami who said it's very simple why they haven't been thrown out. He says, why didn't anyone ever escape from Alcatraz? It's a perfect prison. He says, and in his context, he said, we know. We helped them design it. it is a perfect repressive system. And when you do it on an island, it even perfects it some more. I think, though, that if you look at it from the perspective of, the right of the Cuban people to decide their own future, I think Lars would agree that that is precisely what they should have the right to do. Whether you agree with the Commission on Assistance to a Free Cuba and the recommendations or not, the basic premise, though, is still there. That's the fundamental. That's what Hillary Clinton said in her testimony when she was being confirmed. That's what Barack Obama said during the campaign and said again down at the summit. That's what George Bush has said. That's what Bill Clinton has said. That's what George Herbert Walker Bush said, Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter, Ford, Nixon, Johnson, Kennedy, all of them have maintained that position. And so looking forward, let's look at the three interests that Lars has identified, which I think are actually very good interests to look at in defining where should the policy go moving forward. And the first one is that sort of national security interest. I'll disregard the electoral interest because I think it is an invalid point for discussion. But when you look at the future going forward and designing a policy for Cuba, can we afford a policy that undermines the rest of our allies? When CAFTA was being discussed, I remember a Costa Rican legislator saying, we oppose being part of CAFTA. Of course, they all ultimately in Central America and Dominican Republic became part of CAFTA. But they said, we oppose this free trade agreement with the United States because, and this was towards the end of the Clinton administration, he said, because Bill Clinton is going to lift the embargo with Cuba. And you're asking us to decentralize our economies. You're asking us to move towards free markets, to move towards free trade, to impose appropriate labor standards, to impose environmental standards on our people. And then you're going to completely undermine us when you lift the embargo with Cuba and begin unrestricted interaction with a completely centralized economy with no labor rights, with no environmental standards. So we have to look at the future, not just from the perspective of Cuba, from the U.S. national security interest. We have to look at it from the broader perspective. What's it going to do to those very neighbors that we have asked to join a certain level of international commerce and have appropriate environmental and labor standards? From another perspective, what signal does it send to those countries in Central and South America who are fighting to defend their democracies as they face the phenomenon known as Hugo Chavez? Are we going to send them the message that we stand with them, or do we send them the message, no, you know what, you're doomed to failure because not only have we not necessarily confronted Hugo Chavez, but we're now going to open up with Cuba, and the rest of you are really on your own. And will that bring back the Latin American strongman as opposed to the democratic governments that are in place today? And finally, from the business interest perspective, how are we going to deal with those issues? I think that the fundamental problem when you discuss the embargo and you discuss U.S.-Cuba policy moving forward is that it is a highly polarized and polarized at the extremes debate. You have the crowd that says you must lift the embargo no matter what. And you have the crowd that says you must keep the embargo in place no matter what. And I would submit to you that probably 90% of the members of Congress and people in the executive branch are in the middle somewhere. And when you talk about the business interest, which is where I live, I'm an attorney who practices here. There are a lot of people who say it's not a question of whether you do it or don't. It's the question of doing it right. If we created all these problems that Lars has explained, well, don't we have a responsibility to make sure that when we change our own behavior, that we do it in a way that promotes certain American ideals. And I'll give you certain examples. Have we looked at what it will mean to have a centralized economic system in the middle of the Caribbean hub, competing with all these other countries that are not in that same place? Are we going to push them in the other direction, and what is that going to do for the U.S. businesses that have invested with all of these others? That's just an example. There are many more business issues that will need to be addressed, including the issue of confiscated properties, an issue that, as a lawyer, to me, is fundamental. When the Eastern Bloc fell, those countries went back, in the case of Germany and others, to pre-Nazi days to put systems in place to permit restitution of property or indemnification of the prior owners. Interestingly, the countries that provided restitution of property are the ones that have done the best. But if those countries did it, why not Cuba? Are you sending the signal that, you are inferior, you can't handle it? I would suggest to you that that's not the case, that they need to do things the right way. So those are just a couple of examples, and I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to discuss it further, and I'll turn it over to Tomas.
Thank you, Iggy. I appreciate it. If Dr. Schultz's page was born on page 1 or 2 of his book, and Iggy was born on page 60 or so, was it January of 60? Then I was born somewhere around page 600. So I'm a little bit at a disadvantage on the historical perspective, and so I've been asked to focus on the current the perspective of U.S. policy towards Cuba, and I think it's I think that Lars's book makes some very important recognitions about the absolute failure of U.S. policy, which many of which are still true today. And with all due respect to Iggy, I would suggest that that failure has not only endangered our national security or undermined our national security and our business interests, but also isolated the United States from the rest of the world. One of the important points that Lars makes in his book is about the focus on domestic politics. I think that goes without saying. The only other exile community that's had the influence in formulating foreign policy in this country is perhaps the Jewish American community through its lobbying efforts. And in fact, I believe Iggy knows well that they helped put together the Cuban American National Foundation, again before my time, and trained them on how to on their lobbying efforts. The second is the second point Lars makes is about the United States choosing stability over democracy or over or a continuation of the current system, or stability rather than the possibilities that a change in power or a change in government in Cuba could mean a threat that could represent for the United States. And I think nowhere is that more clear than in a statement that Bush made. I'm going to President Bush 43. I don't have the exact quote, but it's something along the lines of, "We're not looking for stability. I'm sorry, we're not looking for stability. We're looking for change." And so the third one being the inability to multitask. And I think that if you read Lars's book and you analyze U.S. policy towards Cuba and towards a lot of other nations, you would come to the conclusion that there are only about 5 people working at the State Department, when the reality is, of course, that there are bureaus for every region in the world and country desks for every nation. Yet somehow Cuba and other countries in Latin America seem to fall through the cracks until a crisis has initiated. And nor is that more clear than in Honduras, the Honduran crisis, which we've been dealing with as of late. The fixation on Fidel is another important element that Lars talks about, and that's, I think, one of the principal mistakes of our policy is that we're keeping our eye on the problem as opposed to the solution, or the perceived problem as opposed to the solution in Cuba. And trying to address how to get Fidel out of power, we failed to address how to empower Cubans inside the island to take control of their own future. And as for the belief that it's the U.S. mission to lift up poor little Cuba, I think obviously that the CAPSI report is a good example of that, which, by the way, I think is the only publication that has more pages than the book you've written. But I hate to break it to you. I think Lars has great quotes from just about every Secretary of State up until the Bush administration. I think I could add a quote from Secretary of State Hillary Clinton today that says, "Just as no nation can meet these challenges alone, no challenge can be met without America." So I think when you revise it, you can add today's quote to the continuing belief that obviously the United States has to play an important role in fixing the world's problems. So moving on to the domestic or the foreign elements affecting the possibility of improved relations between Cuba and the United States, there's an important window of opportunity for improvement in relations that was sparked by two main factors. One is obviously Fidel Castro's relinquishing of power, at least temporarily or in some form, to his brother, even though we know that he's present in the background and writing his very important reflections. And the second, the election of President Barack Obama, and I'll explain why in a second. On the domestic side, one of the most important factors, I think, driving domestically is the changing attitudes of the Cuban American community. I think it's well documented now through polls done by Florida International University and Gallup and pretty much everyone else who's dared do them, that the community is changing for a variety of reasons, whether it's generational changes or immigration or exhaustion and frustration with the failure of current policies to deliver any of the intended results they claim to or objectives they claim to have had. But there is a change in Cuban American thought, and that is reflected not only in support for a candidate who offered to change restrictions on family travel, but also in the focus and the positions taken by a lot of the groups reflected inside that community. But it's not just the Cuban American community that's changed. And I think that the American community that is not of Cuban descent is also changing. I think in large part to frustration that the status quo not only is not delivering results, but is also undermining other important U.S. interests. Agricultural and business interests, for example, that's one of the most obvious ones, have made it very clear that current policies undermine U.S. business, the U.S. farmer, etc. Even church officials, the U.S. Council of Bishops, made Cuba policy one of 3 legislative issues this year that they'll be lobbying on. In fact, military leaders, a long list of retired generals, wrote a letter to the president asking him to make important changes to U.S. Cuba policy. And then finally, NGOs such as Human Rights Watch, the Brookings Institution, Lexington, and others have also been urging the administration to make important changes to Cuba policy. So why does the election of Barack Obama such an important factor? Well, obviously, especially because on the heels of who he's replacing, President Bush, George W. Bush, I think represented one of the most difficult, the time period he was president represented one of the most difficult or tense times in U.S.-Cuban relations. And so the refreshing perspective of a new president, and one who perhaps a lot of Cubans can relate to because of his background or race, is a very important factor. In fact, polls within Cuba suggest he's very popular. But I think the most important thing for those of us who study U.S. policy is that the threat of veto that President Bush presented in the Congress has been eliminated. A lot of legislation that went before the Congress died in the Congress during those 8 years because there was a threat of presidential veto, and a lot of members of Congress were unwilling to challenge their own party or challenge leadership on an issue they knew was ultimately not going to get signed by the president. The new majority, the new Democratic majority in the Congress, also represents an important factor because not only because of the wide margin that the Democrats now hold, but also because of a lot of the legislation that's been introduced in the past to lift restrictions on travel, require cash payments for goods, expand trade, have been introduced by people who are now actually chairmen of committee in the House and in the Senate. How am I doing on time? 5 minutes? Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, let me move on to some of the foreign aspects. Before that, I would say obviously that some of the challenges we face domestically have to do with the election season coming up in January. We all know that very little gets done on Cuba during election season, except for maybe the CAFC report. But I think there'll be a lot more hesitation in Congress to take on important changes to U.S. policy during an election year. And at the same time, there are still Cuban American members of Congress who still have some important influence that could stall bills aimed at changing policy. On the international side, I would say the renewed interest of the hemisphere to Cuba's reintegration into the region, as shown at the OAS conference and reflected in the resolution that was passed, puts the United States in a position where it can capitalize on improving its image in the region, while at the same time insisting on certain conditions be met for Cuba's reintegration to the OAS. Chavez's influence in the hemisphere can also be limited, can be curtailed, if the United States is able to, at least initially, as it's done, show a willingness to meet and talk and discuss important issues with Cuban leaders. The willingness of Brazil and Mexico to play more active roles, and I would say one of the most important ones being the world economic crisis and the effect that that's had, along with a very active hurricane season last year, on Cuba's economy. Cuban leaders, in fact, today, Phil Peters of the Lexington Institute released a good paper called Relonomics, which studies this issue. And I think that Cuban leaders are facing a very important question, and that's, do we put all our eggs in Hugo Chavez's basket, someone who is facing all kinds of problems domestically, or do we look to diversify our risk by trading and improving relations with other countries? And I think that that's ultimately what it comes down to. It's that the United States' policy of isolating Cuba has, in essence, done two things. It's provided the threat that Cuban leaders need to be able to justify a lot of its positions, and it's also provided an excuse for Cuban leaders to justify all of its failures. I believe that that's why the United States has, moving forward, has to be very careful when it talks about conditionality or reciprocal actions by Cubans when we take steps to change our policy. And that is because it's something that I don't think is brought up in your book, Lars, and something that's very important is we cannot assume that Cuban leaders are interested in improving relations with the United States. I think to do so would be short-sighted, mainly because of, again, the threat that we provide, the perceived threat that we provide the Cuban regime, and because of the excuse that we provide. So as the United States moves forward to increase the effectiveness of its policies, it should do so considering its own national interests and not expecting any reciprocal action from Cuba. I'll stop there and I'll leave some of my observations about the book for the Q&A then.
Thank you, Tomas. We'll now open the floor to question and answer period. There are a couple of microphones that will make their way throughout the room, and we'd appreciate if you could identify yourselves and the institution you belong to. Please, Bill. Let's just wait till the microphone comes around. Thank you.
Thanks. Bill Leogrand, American University. Lars, I think I mean, it's a fantastic book. I have actually had a chance to read it, and everyone should, because it really is an extraordinary piece of research. I want to take the point that you make about Cuba, which I think, as you yourself have written in other places, expands beyond Cuba to Latin America, which is we have this tendency to want to uplift all of Latin America. The asymmetry of power between the United States and Latin America gives the United States, at least potentially, enormous influence. Whenever we try to use that influence to impact the internal politics of a Latin American country, we are tempted toward that tendency to uplift, or at least to rationalize what we're doing as uplifting, if nothing else. The alternative, of course, is a sort of very strict realist approach where we say, well, we're not going to pay any attention to what's going on domestically in these countries. We'll deal with them strictly in terms of our national interest, and we'll use our influence to gain our national interest in foreign relations, and they can do whatever they want domestically. And yet, you and I both were pretty critical of Henry Kissinger when he took that attitude toward human rights abuses in Latin America. We wanted the United States to use its influence to uplift the Latin American governments or change the Latin American governments that were involved in abusing internationally recognized human rights. So the question, I guess, is, there's not a clear line between uplifting for the good and uplifting for the not so good, because we always see the good through the prism of our own self-interest. And yet we've got that influence because of the asymmetry of power. It doesn't go away if we don't pay attention to it. Policymakers will always pay attention to it and always use it. So how does one bridle it, if you will?
Maybe we'll take a couple more questions from the audience, if there are any other questions. Yes.
Carlos Indacochea, George Washington University. I want to focus very narrowly into this issue of confiscated property because I think it's a hurdle. It reminds me that I used to have a little money with Bernie Madoff, and now he's got to get a new address, and my rights are extinguished. And my house used to be worth $1 million, and I borrowed for a Mercedes and so on, and now they can have the Mercedes and the house for 120. There are indeed sunken costs in property rights that are extinguished and that are the product of turmoil in historical events. And don't tell me that in the U.S. it's an issue of invisible hand, because the hands are very visible.
Any other questions? This right here, please.
Hi, thank you. My name is Shirley Pate, and I'm with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Mr. Bilbao, when it comes time to answer the questions that we're posing to you now, if you could repeat what you said just at the very tail end of your presentation regarding Chavez, and that something about the U.S. talking with Cuban officials. I'm not sure if I heard it correctly. I apologize, but if you could go over that point again, I would appreciate it.
Cynthia McClintock, George Washington University. Really fascinating. And I agree with Lars that the tone of arrogance among American political leaders that we know better is a really serious problem that has pervaded U.S. policymaking. I kind of cringe at being quite so pessimistic, going on. And I guess my question is: one, is that arrogance, in your view, an inevitable corollary of the power asymmetry, an inevitable corollary of being a great power? Or when you look at the American population, it's changing so much. You go back to 1901. Now I think in a decade is going to be more than half the population is minority or quote minority, and we now have a State Department of lots of women, and we have an African American president. Is there a chance in all of that for change?
Lisa, you.
Yeah, I have a question that links to Bill's. Which has to do with the support for democracy, and Lars, you and I have discussed this in the past, and I've written on the origins of the National Endowment for Democracy and the context in which it was born in the 1980s. So my critique of NED, I think, is fairly strong. To take up Bill's point, we very much supported, we meaning liberals who work on Latin America, were very supportive of efforts to restore democratic rule in countries ruled by military dictatorship in the Southern Cone in the 1970s and the 1980s. And we thought it was a good thing that the U.S. government would use its power and influence to support Democrats within repressive that were living under repressive military regimes to restore democracy. So why does it become so objectionable to look at that same logic. Why is the discomfort level so high when you take that same software and apply it to the supporting democratic rights in a place like Cuba? So it's not just the human rights thing, it's actually the democracy promotion aspects of U.S. policy. And I'm not saying it's not interventionist. I mean, I think, liberal internationalist principles are deeply interventionist. So why is it seemingly or apparently okay in one set of circumstances and not in the other?
Lars.
All right, Bill, Cynthia. Thank you, Jose Raul. About a month ago, a Woodrow Wilson fellow was getting ready to go back to Chile, Augusto Varas, and I came up and had lunch with him. And in the course of our goodbye lunch, he asked me what I was working on now, and I'm interested in this topic that Bill. There's a group of us who worry about the same things and often come to the same conclusions. And I mentioned to Augusto Varas that the NED seems to have been an exercise in snookering the left. You took a group of neoconservatives out of the Gene Kirkpatrick camp in the early 1980s and looked at all of us good lefties and said, "You're for democracy, aren't you?" And of course we nodded yes, and so we created this institution, and then it goes into a mode where I'm not going to even try to quantify it, a significant proportion of its activities is aimed at governments that the progressive part of the U.S. political spectrum does not want to be a target of the U.S. government. Occasionally, Augusto interjected, occasionally it throws us a bone. It gives us the no vote in 88, 89 in Chile. But for every time we get something out of this intervention, look, we're all talking very frankly here, right? All right. For every time that the progressive part of the U.S. political spectrum gets something out of one of these interventioning organizations like the NED or AID, we enable the other part of the political spectrum to take the same institution and do what it wants to, but it gets to do it 10 times, it seems. My lifetime, my experience has been that we lose. It's a losing operation. Of course, I would be happy to intervene against Pinochet, but I have to say, if the cost of that is creating an institution that we use repeatedly for activities that I disapprove of, I'd say close the institution. I realize that there are costs involved. I understand that there is a lot of good that the Agency for International Development does, and I apologize because I know at least one person in this room works there. But folks, I think we have to recognize that you can't have it both ways. My sense is that the Cuban people in particular would have resolved their own problems of political power long, long, long ago without the United States. Now, I don't know. I said at the very beginning, and I emphasize this because there are 2 Cubans here in this room on this panel. I don't know Cuba. But I cannot imagine. Imagine what would happen if you had if a country like who dislikes us, so Iran were to create a commission to improve the United States, and it produced a 400-page report, the first 48 pages of which outlined 62 steps it was going to take to overthrow the Obama administration. Now, it's that kind. Look, as I said, this takes it to the extreme. There's got to be a reason why I wasted the University of North Carolina's Xeroxing budget to print this darn thing. This is a document. If you have not read this, you really need to look at it, because what it does is it throws into relief, into the sharpest possible relief, this mentality that is the basis for these institutions that I think it's about time to pack in. On another day, if I were sitting in the audience, Bill, and you and Cynthia too were giving presentations, I'd probably ask you the same questions you asked me.
Let me pick up on that. I think the problem with that perspective, though, is sort of what Cynthia was saying before. Either you do or you don't stand against a Pinochet, a Charles Taylor, an Ayatollah, a Fidel Castro. Pick the tyrant, whether they're left or right. If they're repressive and they're tyrannical, you have a position to take, and you need to take a consistent position. And I wrote a piece a few years back that the Miami Herald published, and it was titled, "What Would Thomas Jefferson Say?" Mm-hmm. And basically the premise of my speech was that all the discussion about, engaging Cuba and engaging Fidel and the like would have been repulsive to our founding fathers, because they would have believed in a principle and said, we don't stand for that. And so I think we have to take it back to that. This is a symptom, and focusing on it is funny, but the underlying principle is, what do we as a nation stand for? Do we defend a people whose popular sovereignty has been suppressed, or don't we? That's really the fundamental question.
And if I could, just building on that, if I could take it a step even above that, as a Latin American, I question the wisdom of trying to explain all of Latin America's failures through the failures in U.S. policy. I think if one of the three things that Lars identified was this idea that somehow the Cuban race is inferior or Latin American race is inferior, then I think we do a disservice to Latin Americans by providing an excuse for all of their failures through through our policies. I was born and grew up in Venezuela up until the point where Hugo Chavez came to power, and I can tell you that the reason for Chavez coming to power had a lot less to do with the failures of U.S. policies and the Washington Consensus and all the things that United States usually points to when we hit ourselves in the chest and talk about our own failures, than it did with the failures of the Venezuelan people and our own failures to uplift our own people who we left behind. So, from the Latin American perspective, I think we need to be careful in not trying to blame ourselves for all the failures of nations where, and many times we've acted irresponsibly and are to blame ourselves.
Yeah, I don't like my answer because I think that Ignacio is right. There are principles involved here. And to talk about progressive versus the other side is really inappropriate in that context. What I would argue for is for the United States to use its extraordinary influence to create multilateral institutions, to strengthen multilateral institutions to address issues of egregious violations of fundamental human rights. Rather than to create institutions, homegrown institutions, which politicians can go and grab a hold of and say, I don't like fill in the blank, left, right, or center. I don't like X. Go get him in the name of democracy. And then second, I want to make sure that people understand that I do not want to be viewed as a person who is oblivious to the human rights violations that are occurring in Cuba. My chapter on the Bush administration has a lengthy discussion of the arrests of the 75, of the 4, exactly what they did when they issued, what is it, The Country Belongs to Us All?
Right.
Their document, and the 20-year prison sentences they got for doing so. When the brothers to the rescue planes were shot down in 1996, I wrote, "There is no justification for shooting down unarmed civilian aircraft." That's as simple a sentence as I could write. It is the topic sentence of the paragraph. In the conclusion, I write that few Cubans bargained for the rigid command economy or for the stifling political intolerance that befell their island. There is a huge problem of fundamental exercise of human rights in Cuba today. And I do not want to be the person that ignores it. What I do not want the United States to do is to mount its white stallion and go charging into Cuba as it has since 1898 repeatedly. There has got to be a better way to do that. Thank you.
I think we have a couple of questions we haven't answered yet. If I could just get to the question you asked about Chavez. I think it's apparent that Chavez has a mission to extend his influence in the region, and doing so lessen the influence of the United States. Cuban leaders are presented with the choice or the options of supporting Chavez in this endeavor, which clearly they have. But the United States also has a choice, and that is, do we help Chavez by feeding the accusations, the claims, the nationalism that he uses to fuel his Bolivarian revolution, or do we undermine it by changing our tone, changing our message, sometimes changing our policies? And what I meant to say in that bullet point was that, to the extent that the United States shows a willingness to improve relations with Cuba. Today there were migration talks held or was it yesterday, in New York. To the extent the United States does that, we undermine Chavez's efforts throughout the region to paint the United States as the aggressor, to blame the United States for all of the ills in the region. And so it also, and we saw that after the OAS meeting, or leading up to the OAS meeting, it also helps create space for other countries who, frankly, have found it very hard to support U.S. policies towards Cuba in the past, to do so and apply some pressure onto Cuba as well. When President Obama announced the lifting of the family travel restrictions, there were leaders in Latin America that responded saying, it's now Cuba's turn to act. And so doing that undermines Cuba, and it also undermines Chavez to the extent that we undermine his claims.
I'll give you the flip side of that. There will be those who will say that it does the exact opposite, that it will empower Chavez, that instead it will have sent the message to Latin America, you see, our bloc has won, and therefore you either join us or we will eventually overcome you or take you over, which is his grand plan. Whether that's right or Tomas's position is right, we don't know. But that's what the top analysts are called on to make a call on.
Yes, please.
To go back to this issue, I think we've hit on a very, very fundamental issue about the use of American power. And so, Lars, I'd like to put a question that's been on the table in a slightly different way. To what extent is it a legitimate goal of U.S. foreign policy to concern itself with the internal political dynamics of foreign countries? Now, I have a hard time believing that you would say that it is not a legitimate focus of U.S. foreign policy. The Obama administration has been criticized for not taking a more forceful role, for example, in denouncing, fraud in the Iranian elections. And the fallback onto multilateral institutions, in a certain sense, is a little bit of a cop-out, and this is why I'm pressing you, because the Inter-American Human Rights Commission exists to do this kind of thing. But the Organization of American States itself, as the Honduras crisis has demonstrated, will condemn, an interruption in the democratic process when it's, undertaken by the military or at the hand of the armed forces. But the OAS has been utterly silent about what has been going on in Venezuela, what has been going on in Nicaragua, what goes on in terms of questions of fraud and manipulation of open and fair elections. So multilateral mechanisms are very imperfect because, for the most part, they're made up of governments, and Latin American governments in particular are very wedded to this notion of sovereignty, and they're not going to mess in the internal political configuration. So is that ultimately the argument that you are embracing or advocating be the position of the U.S. government?
No, I recognize the weakness of contemporary multilateral organizations, including, if you remember, the Security Council, which suggested that we not invade Iraq in 2003. But look, one grasps for straws. One does not want to sit quietly and not address issues of repression. But for those of us who study U.S. policy toward Latin America, the abuse that accompanies that so frequently, especially the institutionalization, the creation of institutions but domestic institutions, has been so egregiously, has done so much to harm so many groups that we have to grasp for a straw and start to build multilateral institutions. I know, does anyone else in this room have a better way to address this issue? If you agree that our meddling has been, on balance, counterproductive, and meddling, I understand, is an unpleasant term, our activities have been counterproductive or at least damaging from many perspectives. And if you agree with that, then you have to either say, okay, we'll simply do nothing, or we will try to find some new type of approach, and my approach would be multilateral.
Yeah, I would suggest that the problem with the approach, as was said earlier, is in the case of Cuba, the ILO has raised observations about Cuba's labor violations, dozens and dozens of times. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has done the same, and many other multilateral institutions have made observations about Cuba's violation of labor rights. But that only works to the extent that Cuba cares that these institutions are issuing observations about their violations. So I guess the way I would put it is that nations have a right to condition the full extent of diplomatic relations on certain national values. Now, to what extent that justifies meddling the way you described it by financing groups inside or not, I guess is debatable. But certainly the United States has a right to set conditions on the fully normalized relations based on values that Ignacio's friend Jefferson and others have enshrined in our Constitution.
Let me also address an item we haven't talked to. The gentleman in the back asked a question about the issue of property. And historically, we have to, if you were talking about, someone mentioned the rewriting of the Foreign Assistance Act earlier this morning to me. And when you look at even Kennedy's executive order, a lot of the basis for when we put the embargo in place initially was based upon the confiscation of property. But I think that also goes back to a fundamental issue, and that is what do we stand for? And the reason that I mention that is if you look at that issue historically, when the Russian Revolution took place, an interesting thing occurred. A lot of families fled and had bank accounts in New York. And an issue arose in our own courts that said, and the issue was the new government was saying those accounts belong to us. And the family said those accounts belong to us because we were the owners of the companies. And the U.S. jurisprudence was, no, it belongs to the families. You can't take it by force. The United States won't tolerate that. And it was that precedent that then was adopted throughout Western Europe when the Soviet bloc took over when the Soviets took over Eastern Europe. The families fled to the West. And there's one family in particular that I always like to cite as an example, the Carl Zeiss family. If you look at your Sony camcorder, you will see it'll have a reference to the Carl Zeiss lenses on the side of it. That family fled to the West, and the West in Europe did the exact same thing. They said not only did the United States do this in the cases went through 1920 and 21, but they said no, the trademarks, the rights, the assets outside, we can't force the Soviets to give it back to you, but in our territory, we will not recognize it because it's a fundamental wrong. And when the Soviet bloc fell, the Zeiss family reclaimed the factories and the assets and the like, and by virtue of the fact that the West was willing to say, we won't tolerate this, they stayed in business and were able to go back, and they're a huge success today, which is why you see their name on this on a Sony camcorder or any high resolution lens. You're going to see that name there. The reason I say that is that the United States took that the other countries adopted it. For some reason, when it came to Cuba, the rest of the world said, no, notwithstanding, you are the little brown ones. You can't govern yourselves. We know better than you. Yeah, give it to the government. The people, who cares? Give it to the government. And that's exactly what the West did. The only people that didn't do that were the United States because we stuck to the principle. So it is a fundamental point of importance. And why is it so important? Because repression takes place. Frederick Hayek wrote a book called The Road to Serfdom. The repression takes place when you take a person's property. And so the issue of the fundamental rights of people to be free is tied to the issue of property rights. You take their property, and now they become a serf of the state. In Cuba, you step out of line, your children don't get milk. You step out of line, you lose your meat ration. You step out of line, you don't get a certain amount of whatever of medicine. If you own your property, you tell the government, go jump in a lake. I can produce for myself. I can take care of myself. So the issue of property rights is a fundamental issue that the United States has stood up for historically, and it would be a tragedy if at this stage we were to say, you know what, never mind, we take it back.
I could just say quickly, the flip side of that is, of course, you have to weigh the ethical considerations of how restitution will impact or compensation will impact a bankrupt nation that would trying to get, overcome 50 years of authoritarianism, and also a place that has already housing shortages, how you would deal with kicking out 4 or 5 families that now live in one confiscated property.
And there's no doubt that issue is paramount.
And there are ways to handle that.
And there are very significant ways. Latvia said if you owned an apartment building, you'll get the title back, but you can't kick anybody out for 10 years, and put rent controls in and said instead of paying the government, pay the owner. And then also impose requirements on the owner to make sure to maintain the properties and the like. The history is, if you study what happened in Eastern Europe, is that the countries that didn't pay back but actually gave back industrial properties and put it back to work actually prospered the most. And the most advanced of them was the Czech Republic in its system, and they did the best.
Right.
Sorry to keep jumping in here, and I know we're out of time, so I want to make one last quick comment. I played devil's advocate to Lars, and now I want to do the same thing to Iggy, if I can, which is, what is to prevent the democracy argument being used on behalf of a very different purpose, which is, the restitution of the property rights of wealthy people, for example, which I think is what is the sort of Trojan horse that a lot of people see the invocation of democracy and human rights, and I think contributes to, if I understand correctly, and Bill can correct me if I'm wrong, a perception on the part of regular Cubans that that there is this and a rejection of this notion that the Cuban American community in Miami is simply going to come back in and take over. I see people leaving, so let's try to...
Well, I think it's a very, very important question, and that's why Tomas mentioned, there are issues and ways to address this in the right fashion. I don't think that anyone is advocating that, and I remember when Helms-Burton was being passed that this was a significant concern of the Cuban American community, which is why they said, and if you read Helms-Burton, it specifically excludes any kind of residential property in the Act, because they didn't want that to be the case. At the same time, they said, the productive mechanisms, the commercial enterprises are owned by the state. They're not owned by the people. And so why is it inappropriate to say if an entity owned a particular factory, why shouldn't they get it back? Now, getting it back for the sake of getting it back, I think, comes to the issue that Tomas was mentioning. That doesn't work either. There is a responsibility that goes with it, which is if you are going to go back to Cuba, if you're going to participate, you need to participate. You need to put people to work. You need to do it with appropriate labor standards and appropriate environmental standards. One of the items, and I didn't touch on it before, is a lot of the business that is done in Cuba today. We were talking about business interests. I always throw this question out: is anyone willing to suspend the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act for any investments in Cuba? And I say, please raise your hand if you're willing to suspend the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in Cuba. And nobody will raise their hand. And I said, then how are the American businesses going to work? The point is, though, that the greatest export we have is the way we act, the way we participate, the way we do business in places, the way we do it in a transparent and clean fashion. And to the extent that we can do that, that will reinforce the hopefully democratic institutions in Cuba.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. And as you can see, a very prolonged discussion and a very intense topic, and of course a very big book, which, by the way, we encourage you to outside. The book is for sale, so we please encourage you to stop by and acquire a copy of the book. But before then, I ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful discussion.